So essentially, right, if you're wanting to be a rally lead, one of the few things that I'm gonna go ahead and kind of say this is that there are kind of five general rules to being a rally lead that you need to know, which is, the first rule is you need to know what you're going up against. If you can't tell what the guy's wearing, meaning that you don't know what gear he's in, if you can't tell just by looking at somebody what gear he's in and based on that gear, like I can tell just by looking at this guy that he's got imp cav range a little bit there, and he's got some cav gear, majority cav gear. And so I can basically surmise just by looking at the guy that the guy's mostly cav, but he's using a ranged leader. So then I can't help but wonder, well, he might be going cav range just on that premise alone, and that's all I need to know. Obviously the tier of the gear is important because obviously, if I compare myself to say, I don't know, let's pick somebody random out of the guild, like maybe Apex, for example. All right, just one glance at Apex, I can tell you that with that Frostwind Greatsword, that he's trying to even things out a little bit. He's got range, he's got infantry, he's got infant range, and then he's got infant range, infantry, and then just on that piece, I'm guessing a little bit of cap to even it out just a little bit. But otherwise, it's a majority infantry set with some range. Just by looking at that, I can tell you right away that that's what he's wearing. But now he's got a cav hero, and it's at gold. So that means he's getting a 20% army attack boost. So just by looking at all of that, I can just tell you right away the guy's going in infantry range, and more than likely is an imp phalanx, just because of the infantry set. Does that mean he is? No. But the key part to being a rally lead is you need to be able to determine that right away. If you can't tell the guy is in war gear, you're going to have a serious problem on your hands, especially if you compare yourself to somebody like this, who is in mostly construction gear. So this comes more into the, how do I determine if the guy is an actual rally target? Well, it's pretty clear that, anybody to everybody that either doesn't have their leader as AFK or probably isn't wearing war gear is a target. All right. The next thing you want to be really conscious of, and this is step 2, or at least the rule, and how you actually be a rally lead, is you need to know if the guy's online. So oftentimes we like to check their helps, and we'd like to give it about 30 minutes and come back and see if that help sent has changed. Because ultimately what you're trying to determine is the guy online. And is his guild online? Where is he at? Is he over in the middle of the map all by himself? Is he located in a hive? No, those are important factors to consider, because if you do not consider those, it very well could bounce back and hurt you. So my suggestion is to get kind of a pattern. I almost want to say I like to plan these things out. I actually like to point, scout and check and see what his compositions are. Do I know what kind of armies does he have in his set? So if I look at, we'll use this darkness, for example, but if I look at this, right, and I can't determine based on what he's got in his base, if I can't tell you whether he's inf range or whatever, you need to know essentially what composition the guy is using before you even begin to rally. Oftentimes, if you don't, it will often come back to hurt you. Now, it's not to say that you can't do this blindly, but you can oftentimes find that it's going to hurt if you do. But my suggestion is ultimately figure out what the guy's weakest in, and then aim to counter that. So if, let's suppose in this case, he's using reptilian riders and catapults, I can determine that the one thing that I most likely need to send, because of the fact that it's tier 2 cavalry, I need to send range to counter this, and that's going to do the most damage possible. Obviously, this gets a little bit more tricky if you're starting to hit, maybe, a little bit more mixed, for example. So maybe now it's imp and cav. Often people look at this and they will pretty much jump out of their feet scared because it's infantry and cav and weaken at range usually. Right, and this is often something that most people would assume. Well, if he's sending range, and that's his weakest unit, right? But he's high in cavalry, I shouldn't send infantry, right? You're right. You probably shouldn't send infantry to try and counter that, because more than likely, what's going to hold true here? That he's probably in cav phalanx, and so then you need to determine, well, what could it, and again, this goes back to what gear is he wearing, and that's again, kind of it boils down to the fact that, in a case like this where the guy has the most units is going to actually kind of determine what you need to do. So here, just looking at it, I can tell you that he's probably got cavalry as his main and infantry as his second main. So he could very easily be infantry, but he could also just as easily be cav. And based on that, I would say that, to counter this, I would probably send a lot of cavalry. And the reason why I would do that is because he's not going to have very much range. So if you counter it, by taking out the least common denominator out of this, you can basically get rid of the guards. And then by doing that, all he's left with is the snipers and the cavalry, which means now all I need to send is very high range and very low infantry to counter. That's all you need to do once you've got the guards out. But again, that's assuming you don't get them all completely zeroed out the first time around. But, again, when it comes to being a rally lead, it's just, you need to be really weary of those things. And then comes the third rule, which is compositions, right? Which, again, we kind of briefly just talked about compositions, but oftentimes people are wondering, do I actually need to have, troops in my fort to be a rally lead? And the answer to your question is no, you really don't. Obviously, as long as you have up to 250k, that's really all you need. Really, the main concern is really more about your battle hall in terms of how many troops can you actually send in that rally, and as well as things like getting Mecha Trojan, which is, again, one of the Pat 4 monsters, because again, that just increases, it only further increases the actual amount you can send up to 125k. But again, I say these things because ultimately, when it comes to being a rally lead, you don't necessarily need to have a whole, stack in your base. What's important is more about your army stats. All right, so coming into stats as a rally lead, there are a lot of things you can do to actually improve your chances of winning and doing the most damage. And again, we're gonna focus on the stats in this portion, but we will get into how you can actually improve that even further in the next portion. So obviously, when it comes to actually being a rally lead, it's super important that you have these stats as maxed out as you possibly can have them. I mean, the moment you have them maxed out is probably the best you can possibly do for the average player. And then comes in, with army leadership, with the max bonuses that you can grab down here, as well as inside military command, having these down here maxed out. Again, those are all long-term things for most people, but those are little places where you can really increase the amount of damage that you're going to output. Ultimately, most rally leads that are effective, at least in the late game, are going to be doing about 600% plus in damage. Now, that doesn't mean you need to have a full champ set. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a full purple set. But what you do need to consider is boosts. And you need to know what those boosts are going to be. So a lot of the time, rally leaders aren't going to go mixed. Oftentimes, they're going to pick 1 or 2 unit types that they're going to max in, and they're going to send. So then again, this really kind of depends. This is where you get into the multi-stage of rally leading, where you can be both a cav player, a range player, or an inf player, depending on what you wear. Ultimately, if you're going to be an effective rally lead, you need to be able to know what gear to send against someone that you're, and this goes back to one of the first rules that we had, which was to know essentially what is the guy wearing, and does it matter if I send infantry at him? Will this work? And it boils down to the composition that's in the base. And again, if you don't know what that composition is, then you need to know what that composition is before you even start to think about rallying. But essentially, if let's suppose, going back to the defeat of the Dark Nest at level 3, which I can't believe that even happened. But essentially, though, right, with guards in this case, if you're going to hit and you're going to send cavalry, then you probably need to wear cavalry gear, because again, you're trying to maximize the amount of damage that you can do to the guards. Otherwise, it's not going to do you any good. And again, it goes back to just, simply being, you need to know what gear to wear. The next thing you need to really definitely consider is boosts. So again, you've probably noticed that people will often wear, maybe all infirms when they do rallies, or they'll do all manners. And part of the reason they do this is because what they're trying to do is they're basically trying to grab the army defense or army HP or army attack bonuses. So for 15 buildings, right, if you're going to do 15 buildings at, say, 10%, you're doing, well, essentially that, 150% to whatever the hell you want to increase. HP comes in, comes in handy with rally leads oftentimes because what you're doing is essentially you're bulking up the life of all of those troops in the rally, so it reduces the losses that you take. Now, not to say that you couldn't do this with defense, but defense is not as effective. Now, manners in regard to that strategy, it's the opposite is true in that case. What you're trying to do is do the most amount of damage rather than try to save the amount of troops you have. That comes in handy if you're going to try and rally someone that is incredibly big. So if, like, suppose you're hitting somebody that is like 300 million might, you might want to have as much army attack as you can do, so that way, for every rally you do, you're outputting as much damage to him as you possibly can. So that way, when you actually do get close to zeroing him out, you've done the least amount of, you've killed as many as you possibly can, because there's always that possibility of him shielding. Again, I bring that up because, people wonder, like, what the deal is with these buildings, but that's really the general rule of thumb with that. And then, of course, you can also increase your boosts in places like the prison. So having a level 60 leader increases your troop attack boost a considerable amount. If you want to actually know how much, it's exactly 30%. Which, again, that's a good place to grab attack, as well as killing a leader adds another 38%. So again, we're at like 68% already off of those two buildings alone, but you could also just as easily add like another attack boost, whether that be 20% or 50%. And then again, very quickly you can see you can add an enormous amount of army attack that way if you so choose. But again, there are little things like in the familiars, for example, that now you might want to consider as well with, the little tiny amounts of boosts that you can get off the familiars. Again, those are things that you want to consider because ultimately the stats are going to help you when you are being a rally lead. But they're not everything. If you're going to send rallies at somebody, for as long as you're in war gear and you've got your stuff set up in such a way that you're at least able to, get the amount of troops necessary for the march, that's really all you'll ever need. As long as you're sending as many troops as you can send, you're usually okay. Now, how do I determine whether a rally is going to fail or not is really ultimately, is the guy online? If he is, then you're probably going to have problems. But this comes into the fourth rule, which is to determine basically when I should rally and when I shouldn't rally. Again, it comes into numbers. Again, like I said, I personally don't think you need to have, a ton of troops. You really need to have as much as you can send, which is 250k. For as long as you got 250k on, you're usually okay. The thing that, I would do is if you're going to rally somebody, especially like someone that's like this, where they have little to no gear, there's really little to worry about because he's so small. But when you get into rallying somebody that's fairly big, right? Suppose like if you're going to rally somebody like, we rallied Damn Too Good, who's 1 billion might. All right. Initially, that's probably going to hurt because he's in war gear. And that's key. You don't want to rally somebody if they're in war gear. And I say this, and I say this, and I say this, but very often I find people that will just hit the floor, smack their head against a wall, and fall dead because they kept trying to rally somebody who was in war gear, which I don't recommend at all. Not to say that you can't do it, but it's expensive. It oftentimes costs you more than it needs to be. Now, not to say that it's not impossible. You can do it, but it's more effort than it needs to be. But let's suppose somebody's got leaders, for example, then you can initially, assuming that you know what this guy's leader is, you can get an idea at least that he's probably, let's just assume he's got that 30% army attack boost. We can look at him and we can say he's in war gear. But I can say, looking at it, I can see that he's probably cav range, just based on what he's wearing. That's all I need to know. With 216 million might, let's say he's only got all cavalry and all range. And let's say the guy is offline. All right. The only thing that you need to be super aware of is your gear better? Ultimately, when you're going to hit somebody that is in war, you are prepared to lose losses. You need to be careful of two things here. Is if the guy has more troops than you, which he more than likely does if he's at 216 million troops, okay, and he is in war gear, all right, is your gear superior? Meaning that if he is in cav range, what are you sending to counter that? Meaning you've probably got to be sending infantry and range, right? You're probably high range because we assume this guy is probably going to have a lot of cavalry and he's going to have a lot of range. So you have to think, what counters that, which is infantry to counter the range and range to counter the cavalry. It's the only other way you can do it. But now you have to say, okay, well, if I look at this gear and I just look at it, very plainly, I can look at that and I can assume this guy is probably pushing 200 to 300%. But if you really want to get technical with it, you could very well just take the time to actually look at the stats of these, pieces of gear, actually combine, and actually, if you really had the time, you really could just sit down and have, put the numbers down on paper and actually get a good idea of what he's wearing. And then just take into consideration that the guy's probably wearing attack jewels. And you can assume, that, just based on the tier of the jewel, right? So let's suppose, if he had 3 jewels, they were all at blue, meaning he's doing at least 6%. Across 3, that's 6, 12, and then you got 4 and 4, which is 8. So take 8 times 6. And you can look at that plainly now and say, okay, well, he's probably got X amount of damage, and I can add that to that factor. So I can get a really good idea, if this guy's in this bracket of damage, I can at least get some idea of where I compare to that. If I can do over or more than what the guy's wearing, then you're oftentimes in a pretty good space to actually rally him out. And this is oftentimes what people are wearing gold champ gear, as well as wearing $11,000 heroes and stuff like that. Is just the goal there is to basically make sure that you're always doing as much damage as you possibly can. I mean, and again, this comes back to titles. Again, part of the reason why castles and such are so valuable is for this reason, because there are attack boosts and HP boosts, as well as titles inside the actual base, or even, in Baron and in Emperor, that have a huge influence over how a rally league's going to actually pan out when he's sending out those attacks, And again, I say that because, if you can consider, based on let's suppose you even have access to these, you can actually ask, suppose maybe you want Warden, you can add, a little, not a lot, a little amount of, damage, but you could also just as easily ask for, maybe a Scoundrel title, which will drop his HP down by 10%, making his troops die faster. Or vice versa, you could just do Clown, which drops his HP and his attack, which is probably not a bad idea if you want to reduce the amount of losses you're going to take. You could also just as easily do Thrall, which does kind of the reverse. It does a little bit less defense on his case and decreases his attack. So it kind of does a little bit of both, but I personally think Clown's more effective than Thrall in that aspect. But Scoundrel is pretty well. It's just overall just really good to drop that HP down, because that's going to do the most you could possibly do. But again, when it comes to titles and such, those are little things that you could do to actually enormously increase the amount of damage that you can do on a player. But here comes basically the last and final rule with being a rally lead, which is that, if you're going to be a rally lead, you need to have players that are online, and you need to communicate when you're going to do a rally. Oftentimes I feel like, if people in your guild can actively get on at any given time of the day, that's great. But if you don't actually plan these things out, you're oftentimes going to have a really hard time doing them, and doing them effectively. When you are going to rally somebody, you need to have people online. And if that means you need to go into Guild Mill and say, well, because I look at this guy's player, and I suppose if I go over here, and I know that was not English, but whatever. Either way, but the point is, right, is if I look at this guy, and if I scout him every day, and I get a pattern of when this guy's offline, when he's on, and I can get or at least a gist of how often his guild's online, I can essentially determine what times or what hours of the day could I call my guild to say, hey, be online between this time and this time, and everybody gets, ready to go. Assuming that you got the people online, let's suppose you siren on Wii Gamers or whatever form of communication you do to get somebody online. Ultimately, you want to target this guy when he's offline, and when, if you can possibly catch him, not in war gear. If that holds up, then essentially what you need to do from that point is essentially know what his troop composition is, which if you know the troop composition, then you need to be able to wear the counter gear, just like from the before rules. And essentially, as soon as you've done that, then you need to get everyone to basically either teleport, as in they need to be able to have relocators, okay, to actually relocate, or they need to have speeds, or somebody needs to have speeds to get those troops there. And then essentially, you need to be really careful that this guy doesn't get reinforcements, but if he does, don't sweat it. Just make sure that, if you're going to send the rally, you need to send it as quick as you possibly can. My rule of thumb is never let your enemy know what you are sending. So if you are going to give him the one-up, as in if you want to make sure he doesn't know what you're sending, always send the counter to what you're actually going to send. Because what that's going to do is they're going to assume, or at least their guildmates are going to assume, based on the gear that you are wearing, they will send what they think is the counter, usually, to what you are going to send. That is usually what they do. So if you switch your gear last second, and again, I say this because oftentimes what I will do is I will start out and say, I'll wear some different set, and it may not even be the actual set, but essentially I want to give them the impression that this is what I'm going to send. But when the rally actually starts, that's what I'll wear. But when it comes down to the last second, what I will do is I'll actually switch over to travel speed gear, which basically means anything to everything that gives travel speed. The reason why I do this is because that essentially makes the rally go quicker. And then as soon as the rally is going, I immediately, as soon as it's gone, I switch back over to the actual war gear. So that way, once the actual rally lands, okay, not only have I confused the people that are reinforcing, I've also increased the amount of speed that march is traveling at, and now that I'm in the war gear and the counter that I'm supposed to be in, I'm aiming for the amount of damage, or the most amount of damage. But now, we're not done yet, okay? Now you need to make sure of 3 things here, which is that you need to make sure that the person that you are rallying does not switch war gear at any time. Because odds are, if the guy is online, and the moment he is online, if he switches over to war gear, it will hurt. Usually it does hurt, and it hurts really bad. So, oftentimes especially, and this is a really important rule to follow, if you don't want to hit the guy, the guy's got a lot of troops, my recommendation is do not hit him if he is not in war gear. If he's not in war gear, good. If he's not, don't do it. It's gonna hurt. It usually does. I cannot name a time where it did not hurt in some way. And we're talking maybe 5, 6, or 700,000 dead. It will hurt, and it will hurt so bad that you probably don't want to ever do it again. So please, 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 and I say this again and again and again, if you have to, have people in your guild ready to basically, essentially warn you if he switches over to gear, and be ready to smash that button and cancel. Because if you don't, it will hurt. Okay? But essentially, if the guy doesn't switch gear, all right, then essentially you're going to get a pretty successful hit if he's not in war gear. Usually. Now, I say that because you need to make sure that when you're sending the attack that it's full. Okay? If you're going to send an attack, general rule of thumb is always assume that the person that you are sending the attack on, you need to think that if he's not in war gear, if he's got a lot more troops than what you're sending in that rally, assume that you're probably going to take a little bit of losses initially. But for every rally after that, it'll initially start to get less and less. But when you actually do a rally, I also want to be really, really, I want to stress this a lot, but you want to make sure you know what infirms this person has. That means you need to, generally what I would like to say is you want to be able to actually determine what the guy's got. If you don't know how to know that, you need to have intelligence 10, because what that will do is it will actually tell you what buildings the guy has in his base. So essentially, if he's got say 7 infirmaries, at 7 infirms at level 25, that is 40,000. So just take 7 times 4, that's 280,000. So it's a really easy way to just determine how much dead will go into infirms. And then for everything after that, I can then determine how much or what he will lose. And you can even get more specific than that. If you want to know, like, okay, so if he's got 1.2 million troops, he's got 280K, so I take that out. That's a million troops. Let's suppose that 500,000 of those troops are tier 3. Just on that premise alone, I can take 500,000 and multiply that by the amount of might. And I can tell you how much might he'll lose. So if he's at 500,000, okay, at 500,000 times 24, that is exactly 12 million might the guy will lose just in that attack alone. Again, it gets even more expensive if you're talking tier 4s. But again, the idea is really, 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 really simple. But yeah, essentially, once you've determined that and you've actually gotten a successful hit, okay, then you need to repair, you need to heal, you need to keep, make sure that you've actually checked your infirms and made sure that you've healed whatever you've lost at that point, and prepare the second rally if you need to. Again, this, a pretty standard rule of practice is that you want to make sure that you get the second rally going as soon as you can, especially if you don't have any troops, because the moment you do, you're not going to lose your leader if they come by and smack you, because essentially you don't have anything technically once you've started that rally in there. They won't be able to get anything. But essentially then you need to get, the second rally started, and you need to check the report. So before you send that rally or start that second rally, you need to determine now, what does the guy have left in there? So if you've gotten rid of all of his guards and say he's now just got cav and range, then send range to counter the cavalry and send infantry. And you probably don't want to send too much infantry because he's got a lot of cavalry, right? So send a lot of range. But go now. Then you also, once you've done that, then you know what his formation is. So then determine what formation that is and counter the formation as well. So if he's in cav phalanx, go range phalanx. Again, I say that because you want to counter the phalanx, or whatever formation that he's in, so that way you get the maximum amount of damage you can output at that point. Now, assume that the people that are reinforcing him are probably going to know what you were sending at this point, but because they're either worried that he's going to take losses at this point, as long as he doesn't switch war gear, they will continuously lose. Even though they'll do that, it's going to cost them probably more troops than is really necessary. And the goal of this is to basically continuously smack them and kill as many as you possibly can. But essentially, once you've done that and you've done as much as you possibly can at that point, then the only thing I can say is that once you've done that and you've actually rallied this person out, is that you can then determine, does he have any resources? You'll know that by report, and if he does, then what I recommend doing is switch over to gathering gear and start pulling as much as you can possibly send. That means sending infantry, because infantry has the highest capacity, so that you can grab as much as you can possibly grab off his account before he shields, or if his guild begins to reinforce him again. Again, just try to grab as much as you possibly can, because that's really the goal there, is to probably solo him out and clear him out of his resources, so that way you get the most for your buck. But the moment you've done that and he's completely cleaned and that he's pretty much done, you've essentially successfully rallied the guy out. And then you can pour it out, take your victory, and do whatever you want with his leader at that point. But that is pretty much the tips that I have in regards to being a rally lead. And again, I could say that there's a lot more to it that you could get in particular with. And I say this because, again, it's really general, but when you send leaders, for example, and I'll say this because this is probably important to point out, but when you actually do send a rally on somebody, I do recommend that when you do send a 2-unit type mix, that you want to send your army attack heroes, for free to play, that's going to be Bomb and Goblin and Rose Knight, and then whatever focus you're in. So if you're going to be in range, you want to have some range heroes in there. If you're going to be infantry, you want to send some infantry heroes in there. But you also want to be really careful of the fact that whatever you are sending, you don't want to send, like heroes like Trickster, where they don't provide any army boosts. You want to be really mindful of that, because if you don't, it's a waste. I say that because oftentimes people don't pick up on this, but as you can tell, there are actual boosts associated to heroes. So be mindful of this when you are sending your attacks. But needless to say, I hope that it pretty much covers most of that topic. But if there's anything more that I haven't said, feel free to say so in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys next time.